Good evening, everyone. It feels like a long time since we've done one of these. So hopefully our technical skills keep up to scratch and we'll manage to keep this running like we normally did in the past. But we're here tonight to talk about some fantastic whiskies, the Tomaton French collection, which was just released a couple of weeks ago. We're going to be trying each of the whiskies. We're going to be giving you a little bit of a rundown as to the concept behind the series. We're going to be joined by Don Davies from the Whiskey Exchange as well, providing that everything goes well with the internet. But before that, Graham, great to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well, thanks. I had my second COVID jab yesterday, so I should be a bit like Superman now and immune to everything, hopefully. Yeah. Well, another couple of weeks maybe, but...
Yeah, well, thankfully for everyone who's going to be trying these whiskies, you never lost your sense of taste or smell over the last year. So,
well, it's questionable if I ever had a sense of taste, but that's not anything to do with whiskey.
Yeah, well, that's not worrying at all whatsoever. But as most people will know, logging in, we last year we never released any limited editions. We did a couple of market exclusives, but nothing on a wider scale. So this is the first limited release we've had in quite some time, and really exciting whiskies to talk about. But before we do that, how are things at the distillery? What's going on in the wonderful world of Tomaton?
Things are actually quite good, to be honest. It's obviously been a strange year, the same as it's been for everyone else. We last year at the start of COVID shut down early to let people go home and isolate, basically. So we actually had what should have been our summer shutdown was in sort of March, April, May time. And then we reopened the distillery once things were a bit better and ran through the rest of the year. Had a close down at Christmas again, and with the second COVID wave coming in January, February, we actually remained closed at that time as well and lost our sort of Easter, summer and October shutdowns. So we shortened the summer one. We'll still have a shutdown then, but the guys are in working to do whatever needs to be done. Our shift operators work 3 weeks out of 4. They normally do that in the 4th week. They would join the warehouse team. But to try and keep some sort of separation between all the staff, given the pandemic that's ongoing, they actually get every 4th week off, which I guess is wonderful if the weather's nice. And the same goes for the warehouse team. We're only taking them in for the minimum amount of hours they need to work. So if we only need 28 hours in the week, they can go home thereafter. As long as we get the work done, that's all that matters. So it's actually working quite well for us. Demand for whiskey, certainly since the start of this year, is actually through the roof. It's absolutely flying, which is great. I don't know whether that is because last year there was less whiskey bought. I mean, we had a good year last year in relative terms. The branded sales were slightly down compared with the year before, but not bad. So I don't know if the first 4 months of this year is everyone playing catch up, or if this is going to be a trend that's going to continue. From my company hat on, let's hope it continues. From my stock control hat on, let's hope it just stays quite gentle. So it's a bit convoluted how I look at these things. But no, it's been very good. And whenever I talk to any of the guys and girls at work, they all seem quite buoyant, quite positive about how things are going. And no, it's looking quite good. It's looking good.
Yeah, I was up in Inverness today, poking into a few of the little bars and seeing how everyone's getting on with the first week of opening, and there is a real buzz about the place, and everyone's kind of ready to get going, and quite a lot of tourists around as well. And I think that's been replicated across the country. I don't think it's just Inverness that's experiencing that. So hopefully that translates into whiskey as well.
I think so, yeah. I mean, obviously we've just not long opened our visitor centre again, but it's only open on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Again, it's maybe slightly excessive overkill, but we just thought, well, do we want to open up to all of the public all of the time, or will we just wait a few weeks yet and see how things go? so that by opening on a Friday afternoon and Saturday, Sunday, all our operators are away home because we just work until lunchtime on a Friday, which means that we don't risk the operators actually coming in contact with the public where there could be potentially a spread of COVID. But let's hope there's not anyway. But it's a measure we can take meantime until we're a bit more confident that we can open during the entire week and get back to the normal 7 days a week opening of the visitor centre and tours and everything. But all the signs at the moment are looking quite positive. So here's for a good latter half of the year anyway. So fingers crossed.
Absolutely. But we're here tonight to talk whiskey, talk about 3 whiskies in particular, the first 3 releases of the Tomaton French collection. And we're not going to be alone in doing so. We've sent sample kits round to several competition winners. I know many of you in the chat maybe already have your full collection already, which is fantastic. So everyone that's watching as we're going through the evening, feel free to send any questions you've got in, but also let us know what you're thinking of the whiskies as well. But Graham, we always like to be joined on screen by a guest, and we're talking about whiskey matured in wine casks tonight. So who better than a master of wine who also happens to be the head buyer at the Whiskey Exchange? So we are joined tonight by Don Davies. Hello, Don.
Hi guys, sorry, I had mad panic because my internet decided to just not work. So I have moved into a far less glamorous location than I was before.
It's a real shame. Nobody will know the quality of plant that you had growing behind you. That's a real shame, a real miss.
I was getting serious background envy.
Well, now it's not so exciting.
But the main thing is you've been able to join us, which is fantastic. And I know we're going to be trying the whiskies tonight as well. But before we do that, Don, give us a little bit of a background into your kind of journey through booze. How did you go from getting to wine in the first place, and how did that go all the way through to spirits as well?
So I always say I started my journey into drinks in the King's Bar in Edinburgh, where I actually worked with an amazing gentleman there called Ian, who is still in the hotel, who's one of the managers there. And he stupidly hired me to pull pints in the pub. And I hadn't got a clue what I was doing, you know. And I was like, what's this stuff on the back shelf? And I just remember tasting it. And remember, actually, one of my first whiskies was probably, I think it must be a Jura or something. Ian was quite keen on that. And I was like, what is this stuff? Because before I'd been really kind of drinking like tequilas and wines and things like that, because I grew up in America. And so I left there after sort of working for quite a while, but I really was into food. I loved food. I've always been a cook, and I wanted to work in restaurants. And I basically went to this amazing restaurant in Sydney called Tetsuya Wakuda's. And I had that eureka moment where I decided that booze was my life. And it was when I had this amazing tasting menu with the most incredible wines to go with it. And I thought, that's it. I'm going to be a sommelier. That was it. Just decided. Went back to London, got a job for Tetsuya in London, just as a waitress. And then ended up going to Zuma and opening Zuma, where I helped the head sommelier there. And she left to go to Australia, and I was the only person that knew the wine list. So they said, do you want to be head sommelier? I was like, yeah, sure. Not got a clue. No clue about wine at all. Hey, why not? I've just been really lucky. I kind of worked for Gordon Ramsay, and then that wasn't kind of lucky, but I did work for him. And then I worked for the Square, and then of course I opened around the Ledbury, and then just kind of had enough of 90 hours a week. Seem to be doing that now, but decided to kind of, that was enough. I wanted to kind of get out of restaurants, and Ewan, who was my turned out to be my boss, he was one of my customers, and he was the head of Selfridges Food, and he said, do you want to come and work for Selfridges? And I was like, don't really want to work in the shop. Nah. Oh, I'll go because he's my customer and I have to be polite. And I wasn't really listening to him through the interview. And because I decided I didn't want the job. And then he goes, well, do you want to be the head buyer for Selfridges? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Thanks. So that's where I kind of learned to love spirits. And at the same time, I started working for Selfridges, where I was there for 9 years. I did my Master of Wine, which was the worst thing ever. If you want to lose your life, do the Master of Wine. And then Sukinda and I had been friends through that whole time. quite a few funny stories about me and Skinned drinking. And him and Raj Beer invited me to be their head buyer. And again, didn't believe them. But here I am. And I've been super lucky. The great thing about the spirit industry is people are really, really willing to teach you. Dave Brum being a huge inspiration to me and being a real mentor in terms of teaching me things. And there's been so many others. So yeah, and now I get to talk about wine and whiskey. What could be better?
Fantastic. I do love hearing everyone's kind of journey through the industry, because it's very rarely a set path. I've never heard two stories that are the exact same, and there's always these chance encounters. And as you say, the people you meet along the way that are incredibly generous with their knowledge and their passion is fantastic to see. And hopefully you're going to be helping us out a little bit tonight with a little bit of wine knowledge as well, which is fantastic. Certainly for me, we're using some relatively rare casks throughout this series, and I'm not ashamed of saying that there are a couple of wines here that I was introduced to through these whiskies, which I think is a wonderful thing to be able to do. But before we go into them individually, Graham, the French collection, what's it about? What's the whole series? What's the concept?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually to a certain extent a follow-on series, series 2. Back a few years ago, we did the Quattro Series, which was 4 different styles of sherry. And we took whiskey of the same age, put them into the 4 different sherry casks, basically on the same day, and left them in there for the same length of finish. Because we prefer to do this with finishes rather than full maturation, because it actually works better to show you the similarities and the differences that you can actually get in there. So it was kind of at the time when we were launching the Quattro, that we decided, well, this idea works. It was very, very well received. So at that stage, we're always, as you know, Scott, we're always on the lookout for unusual casks, interesting casks. And that can be driven 2 ways. One way is we have good relationships with the coopers, who will actually call us up and say, look, we've got some of these casks coming in. Are you interested? Knowing that in all likelihood we will be. But we can also go to them and say, look, we've got this idea. We're looking for some unusual casks that fit into this. What can you do for us? And it's not just down to one cooper. We have coopers in Spain, France, Craigellachie, all over the place. America as well, in Louisville, Kentucky, and such like. So it's quite a good network of opportunities, you might say, to both get advised of unusual casks, but also be able to ask the question and find them. So it just so happened at that time that one of the coopers had these casks available in relatively small numbers, but they had a batch of different types of wine casks, all of them sweet French wine. Offered us the opportunity to get them, and it was too good a chance to pass up, because I mean, it's one of those things you never know when you buy the cask and you put the whiskey into it. You never know 100% what's going to come out the other end of the maturation. You can have an educated guess. I must admit, a bit like you, Scott, the wine, I had heard of the Mombasiac, and I'd obviously heard of Sauterne. I've actually been lucky enough to have drank one of, in fact, the most famous Sauterne wine on quite a few occasions in a former life. Probably at that time, didn't even understand how lucky I was, but it was just one of those opportunities that came up on 2 or 3 occasions, and I didn't turn it down. So it was kind of learning about what these wines would potentially give us, and then putting the whole system together, speaking with the rest of the team and looking at what age we thought we would want this to be, because the age can drive certain things. It can drive the style of the whiskey, how much oxidation is taking place in the character of the spirit, but it also drives things a bit more mundane, like price point, and all that. All of this is to be borne in mind as to what customers are going to be interested, what sort of value they will be willing to pay for a whiskey. Get all of that right to keep the interest going in what we can actually do. And this is going to sound quite arrogant, and it's not intended to be, but it can be a bit of an educational journey that with the Quattro series, it was so good to be able to give people the opportunity to try 4 whiskies that were identical other than the casks that they were finished in. So this is just a replica of that with different casks from a different part of the world. So that's a rather long-winded answer for a relatively short question.
Yeah, but I mean, it's incredible because the reception to Quattro was overwhelming.
Yeah.
Back at that time, back in 2015, you would hear people say, "I love whiskey matured in sherry casks," but they would never go any further into what type of sherry casks. So being able to explore that was great. And with this, what we've been able to do is take whiskey that was all distilled in 2008, matured for 9 years in refill American oak hogsheads, traditional Scotch whiskey cask, and finish it for 3.5 years in these sweet wine casks. So the spirit going into the casks is the same. It was vatted together and then filled into the 3 casks. So again, it is that wonderful compare and contrast. And I think with that, it's probably a great time to be getting into whiskey number 1, which is, as you can tell from my bottle, I've been doing a few of these tastings in the last couple of weeks, but whiskey number 1 is the Mombasiac edition. And I think the perfect place to start, Don, is for you to tell us a little bit about Mombasiac, because I know for me, it's certainly not a wine I was very familiar with before I started looking at these casks and looking at these whiskies that we're making.
So, I mean, I'll probably kind of almost talk a little bit about Mombasiac and Sauterne together just in terms of process, because essentially Mombasiac is, I don't want to say poor man's Sauterne, but they're very, very similar. They use the same 3 grape varieties, which is Semillon, Savillon, and, oh my goodness, my brain's just gone absolutely dead. Muscadel. Sorry there. Brain. In my head, I had Mombasiac as a grape variety. It is not a grape variety. So the difference will really be in terms of the proportion of grapes used, but the real key, and one of the things that's super important about sweet wines from the area of Bordeaux, and both are in the area of Bordeaux. So in terms of Sauterne, it's right on the kind of edge of the river, the Dordogne and the Gironde, on the end of that river, which is very, very important. And Mombasiac is a little further west and a little further south in the area of Dordogne. But again, it is on the tributary of a river. So, these rivers are hugely, hugely important. And the other thing that's really important is you're very close to the coast. And the coast of Bordeaux really gives you that maritime climate. If you look at Bordeaux as a climate, it has humidity. It does have quite variable seasons, but there is that influence of the oceanic influence, which actually moderates climate quite nicely. So Mombasiac, just being a little bit further inland, will have a little bit more extremes of climate, but we're talking quite similar in terms of style. In terms of soil types, you're looking at a little bit more limestone in Mombasiac, a little bit more sort of gravel in Bordeaux, just because of the area. It's kind of almost a continuation of that left bank, which is all the sort of the Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Margaux, down into the Entre-deux-Mers. So the most exciting thing, and the reason the climate is so important in this region, in both regions of Sauterne and Mombasiac, is this lovely little thing called Botrytis cinerea, which is essentially a mold. And in the wrong conditions, it turns into what we call grey rot, which is bad mold. And in the right conditions, it turns into this wonderful, glorious thing called noble rot. Because, of course, if you're going to have a mold and it's going to do great things, it's got to be noble, why not? And what happens is that the fogs come down those rivers in the morning and they get stuck in the sort of the valleys and the hills that sort of line the regions, both. And these mists just sort of sit on the vines in the mornings. And what that is creating is moisture. Now, if that mist stays the whole time, then and doesn't ever dry, then rot will continue. It will stay and it will become a grey rot, a bad rot. If, though, as is normal in Bordeaux and in Dordogne, the sun comes out and the mist rise and it dries, this rot, botrytis, actually it pings little holes in the grapes. And then it actually sucks out the water. So what you're doing here is you're concentrating sugars and you're concentrating flavors. Now, this is one of the key ways to get a sweet wine. So a sweet wine can be made in very different ways. Botrytis, it can be an ice wine, which is very similar. You're removing the water through removing the ice. You can stop fermentation, which we'll talk about on the Riveso. But this botrytis is the thing that gives you this lovely sort of concentration, this apricot, this slightly kind of nail polish remover in a very good way. Nail polish remover kind of character. These apricots, these dried fruits, because what it's doing is concentrating those grapes. Now, in Mombasiac, in terms of difference to Sauternes, one of the main difference is they're using less Semillon and less Sauvignon, and we'll talk a little bit about Semillon and Sauvignon when we talk about Bordeaux, and they're using more Muscadel. And Muscadel is this very lovely perfumed varietal. It adds more floral notes. It adds this really gentle. Think of it, if you're thinking about Champagne, and you're thinking Pinot Noir, Chardonnay being the noble varietals, and then you have poor little Pinot Meunier sort of languishing in the corner, but actually produces these beautiful fruity champagnes. This is what is the same for Muscadel. Muscadel produces a lovely fruity floral style. So if you're looking at something like a Mombasiac that's kind of typical characters you'll get, anything with botrytis is going to give you that sort of apricot-y note, that sort of honeyed character. But with Mombasiac, you're going to have lovely little fresh floral notes. I actually prefer Mombasiac to Sauternes because there's a freshness to it and a more sort of forward, youthful character than you'll sometimes find in Sauternes. So that's really sort of Mombasiac in a nutshell. It's just this really sort of pretty floral fruits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, and I love the description of the Muscadel grapes. They're just being that little bit lighter as well. Why do you think Mombasiac has been the little cousin of Sauternes for so long? Why has it not had so much time in the sun?
Well, unfortunately, the position of Sauternes is very, very close to Bordeaux. And if you think about the center of winemaking in France, was very much Burgundy and Bordeaux. And that was very, very much due to the fact that it's so close to the ports. The ports were very important for getting wine out of, especially to the UK. We drank everything from France. And so, that Sauternes became, and also it was one of the ones in the 1855 classification of the Medoc. Sauternes was very much seen as a first growth, it was seen as one. Yquem actually has a status that's far above any of the other houses. It's not even a first growth, it's a first grand growth, which was its own little classification. So Sauternes was very much a drink that was drunk in the courts of France. It was very much a drink that was seen as so highly regarded because the cost that goes into making it, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of Sauternes and why it's more expensive than Mombasiac when we cover Sauternes. Whereas Mombasiac was seen as the sort of the little poor cousin, and also the real problem with Mombasiac is in sort of before 1993, which is when they kind of tightened up the laws. There was a lot of bad wine made there, so they were adding too much sulfur. They were not hand harvesting; they were machine harvesting, which really you can't do in sweet wine. So when you have grapes affected by botrytis, you have to go through and pick in tries. So you would go through the vineyard, you would hand harvest even berry by berry what is ready, and then go through again and harvest the next lot that's ready. So really, a harvest for botrytis grapes can be from September all the way through to the end of November. So it's a really long harvest period. And if you're just machine harvesting, you're getting a lot of grapes that aren't ready. So there was less. And the laws are still not as stringent in Mombasiac. But there's some people doing some really fantastic wine. That Ancien Coeur is absolutely fantastic. It's probably one of my favorite wines from that region. So, there's definitely some really lovely, affordable styles coming out of Mombasiac now, and it's really a much better quality. So from 1993 onwards.
Yeah, that's very interesting to understand that as well, because I think nowadays, when everything is so close together and the world is such a small place, we forget historically how important port towns were and things like that. But you also touched on something that was very interesting, that Mombasiac casks, because of the reputation of Mombasiac, and perhaps not even reputation, just the fact that not as much sells as Sauternes, the casks are so much harder to come by, and they're very rare. But I mean, historically, as you said, the UK would drink anything that came out of France. And there's this wonderful phrase from the 1800s that Scotland was knee-deep in claret. And I think when we think of the cask types being used in the 1800s, the norm is to think of the sherries and the ports. But in fact, there was a huge amount of French wine casks being used in Scotch whisky production over 100 years ago. So, Graham, this is in many ways a return to a cask type of old. So how have the Mombasiac casks affected the whisky here?
Yeah, as you say, it is a return to the casks of old, going back into history to a great extent, because, I mean, the vast majority of casks that are used in whisky production now are ex-bourbons, but that really only started in the last sort of 70, 80 years. Prior to that, it would have been mostly sherry, wine casks, claret casks, as you say, would have been the norm back in the day. So we are kind of going back to that, yeah. It's one of these interesting things that, I mean, I had a look at the colour of the three whiskies, and probably the lightest of the three is the Sauterne. And I don't know if I was 100% expecting that, but then I didn't know enough about the other two to actually, certainly when we first started on this journey, to actually know what impact would the former wine than in the cask, what that would have on the whisky. So it's always an exciting time when we draw the samples out and have a nose, have a taste, and such like. And it also kind of defines when we're actually going to decide that the whisky is ready. The casks have had enough influence. And that's maybe more of a challenge in some ways when you're doing a group of three, because they may actually mature at slightly different speeds. So you've got to try and judge it to get the three of them at what we think will be the best across the range. But these ones, the Mombasiac, I mean, the descriptors that Don used there for some of the characteristics you get from the wine were tremendous. I was certainly sitting here intrigued, thinking I should have taken a notepad in here with me and taken notes on this, or I should have recorded it or something, because I would quite happily sit here for the next couple of hours listening to you speaking about the wine. So the whiskey, although you mentioned the more floral notes in the Mombasiac, although there are undoubtedly floral notes in there, the fruitiness comes through, and it's the real sweetness. You've got a sort of syrupy type sweetness on the nose to me, and also potentially something a bit richer. I don't know whether it's not really nutty. It's more sort of coffee type character comes through. Very subtle.
Because for me, it's quite interesting because I've never tried Tomaton new make. What is the kind of key notes in that? Because in all of them, and I've tasted all of them, there's this lovely sort of orchard fruit.
Yeah. That's one of our key characteristics. The house style, you might call it, with Tomaton is a fruity character, which is normally like orchard fruits, apples, pears, that sort of style of character. You can sometimes get more citrusy notes in there as well, but it is more orchard fruits, I would say. And also a subtle sweetness that comes through, a sort of butterscotch, vanilla, that family, but not overly intensely so. It's just quite soft, very arguably too easy to drink, dangerously easy to drink.
I get that slightly creme caramel on this, and there's this sort of almost apricot jam, which I do wonder that if it is coming, that's more maybe coming from the cask.
I think it could well be, yes, yeah. That would certainly make sense. Apricot isn't something that I would normally look for in our normal style of whiskey, so that probably is an influence that has come directly from the cask, as you suggest there, yeah.
Yeah, I was getting in Tomaton like a sweet malty aroma as well. It's almost like a granola bar type of sweetness in the spirit, and I think certainly for me that's carried through these releases. But yeah, the orchard fruits are there in abundance. For me, I get this wonderful dance between the light orchard fruits, but then, as you say, that almost maple syrup and espresso sort of, not bitterness but darkness, a depth to the whiskey.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned, well, espresso, that's maybe better actually than me saying it was a sort of coffee nutty type character. There was a darker note I was finding in there. Bearing in mind, I'm going to get my excuses in early here. I did have my COVID jab, as I said earlier, yesterday, so I'm not confirmed that my nose is working properly tonight.
And I think the palate's interesting. I think you do have that slightly sort of fresh, sweetness that comes through. I get more a little bit, maybe your nuttiness is almost my kind of acacia honey. There's or sort of roasted, like honey roasted almonds or something. There's maybe a little bit of that is, I think, maybe.
Yeah, I
mean, I'd be white chocolate maybe slightly, but maybe that's a textural thing.
There's definitely something chocolatey type idea in there, I would say. And I mean, initially when I tasted it, it was the fruity character that I found, but the aftertaste, it's just, I would hate to say that it's spicy particularly, but there's a hint of some sort of spiciness in there. You know, it's all quite subtle. You know, it's nothing's really overwhelming here in any way. So that it's achieved quite a nice balance, I think.
Yeah,
it's very drinkable. I think you're right. It's kind of that slightly moreish, I've drunk half the bottle kind of a thing. You know, you put the glass down, you're it's empty. Whoops.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, certainly for me, when we get onto the Sauternes, that's when we get to almost dessert whiskey level. It is quite sweet, but I think here it's not too sweet. And I wonder if that is more of that muscadel grape being used, a slightly lighter body of wine, so it's not quite that sticky sweet that we get from the Sauterne.
They definitely aren't. I mean, if you think about the yield per hectare, in terms of sort of the kind of mostly in Mombasiac, and yield per hectare has a really direct correlation to kind of the intensity of fruit you're getting off the vine. So if you think of kind of the yield per hectare being in Champagne 100 hectolitres per hectare, that's a lot, 100, 120. If you go down to, say, Mombasiac is around, I think it's around 40 hectolitres per hectare. Right, you go to something like Sauternes, you go into something like a Ken, which is the extreme. Yep. It's 7 hectolitres per hectare in a Ken, which is very, very special. I mean, that's huge. So, you know, that concentration. Also, when we talk about the Sauternes, we'll talk about the use of wood, because that's very, very important in Sauternes. But yeah, Mombasiac they don't age as long as Sauternes. They don't have the concentration. They don't have the complexity of a Sauternes. That's why, for me, actually, I really love them, because they have this brightness and this freshness, which I think you do see in the freshness in here.
There's definitely a sort of zestiness to it. It's quite a young, fresh. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not like a young whiskey. It's quite youthful and quite zesty. It tingles on the tongue to a great extent.
Yeah. Now, Don has done a fantastic job of telling us about the regions of France that these wines have come from. But if you're wondering what that maybe looks like, we've developed a series of short clips to go alongside each of these whiskies, voiced over by a particular Arcadian that might be on the call. If you see the boxes, on the back of each pack, there is a QR code. And nowadays, everyone has a QR code scanner, because it was the only way you could order a pint for the last year. But if you scan that code, it will take you to our landing page, where you will see these short videos for each expression. And what we'll do throughout the evening is play these. So as you're drinking this whiskey, as you're having a nose of it, as you're having a taste of it, have a little watch of these clips. What we've tried to do here is bring the whiskey drinking process into all senses. So as well as the nose, taste and feel that you get from the whiskey, the sights and sound of these clips are fantastic. And if you're wearing headphones, it's an incredible experience. But even if not, they are wonderful clips. So as you're drinking the Mombasiac edition, we will play the clip for that now.
Mombasiac represents the sweeter side of life. From the southern banks of the Dordogne River, the vineyards of this region can be traced back to the 11th century, producing wines that are sweet and full-flavoured. It's the soul of the wine casks that have imparted unique flavours into our whisky. On the tip of the glass, we are welcomed with the intense citrus aromas, paired with powerful espresso notes. The palate is dominated by sweet cereals, honeycomb and walnut, with a rich, syrupy finish. In the heart of the Scottish Highlands lies the Tomaton Distillery. Here at Tomaton, we produce a wide range of single malt Scotch whiskies using 100% Scottish barley and casks from all over the world. The Mombasiac edition, part of the Tomaton French collection.
Well, Graham, I must say the French department at Orkney High School did a great job there. You nailed the pronunciation.
I was just in love with the little bunny rabbit in Tomaton. I was like, I love that bunny.
Yeah,
well, 20,000 of them, I would say.
we did for a little time have almost like a pet wild rabbit called, was it Frank it was called?
Fred, wasn't it? No, it was Frank. Well, we only had 3 in total over the year. But no, it was Frank, the last one, yeah.
So I saw that Grants today have hired a dog. We just had 3 bunny rabbits in a year. But there's a couple of questions that have come in. Sam Clark has asked a question more specific about red wine casks. And while we're on the subject of wine casks, Graham, I think this is an interesting one. With aging in red wine casks, do you find that if the wine that comes out of the cask is quite heavy on the tannins, that the whiskey will be sweeter as the tannins have been stripped out of the cask? What's your thoughts on that?
I don't really know. It depends, obviously, on the wine itself. It's difficult to make a generalisation of red wine versus white wine, because there's such a range available in each. And the amount of wine that is actually left in the cask, it is only what's soaked into the oak. And the oak will only allow it to soak in maybe about 4 or 5 millimeters, not much more than that. So if you think about it, the sheer sort of wine to whiskey ratio is very small. So that I'm inclined to think that it's how the wine interacts with the oak rather than the wine itself. It's not like adding some wine into the whiskey. It doesn't quite work like that. It depends on how the wine has interacted with the oak, how it's been absorbed into the oak, and then how our whiskey spirit actually draws that back out again, because it may not take all the component parts of the wine back out. So I wouldn't like to say that it becomes sweeter with a red wine than a white, because I would say I would be hard pushed to. I can't really argue against it. But as I say, I think it depends on the individual wine as to what the influence will be.
It's interesting because I have a theory, and I'm not a whiskey maker, so you can feel free to ignore me. I don't often like red wine cask aged whiskies or finished, because I actually think the tannin creates dryness and astringency. Especially when you use certain types of red wine. Now you have to think, and Graham nailed it there, red wine isn't all the same. A big, heavy Cabernet from Europe, which doesn't have sweet fruits, that has a lot of dry, astringent tannins, and maybe put into a very new active oak, will be very, 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 very different from a Pinot Noir from New Zealand, which has generosity and juiciness and soft tannins, because a red grape will have a different level of tannins in the skins, and so will take different types of oak. And I think it's the combination of the type of oak used, the provenance of the cask is hugely, hugely important. And something I've kind of been quite vocal about in terms of wine cask finishes. But I think that's really where it's tannin will never, for me, from a wine perspective, never give you sweetness. Unless you have a soft, sweet, you do get sweeter tannins like in Syrah, and you have astringent tannins like in Cabernet. But yeah, I think you're right. It's one, how long does it have in terms of contact? Also, remember, tannins soften with air. So if it's a longer finishing, I feel it's better, because those oxidins will affect the alcohol and the tannins. The ones that I see that don't work are the very short finishes in red wine cask. Sorry, that was just me.
No, that all makes perfect sense to me as well. And the one thing you did touch upon it there is the type of oak, because that makes a massive difference. European oak. Well, if you take it down to French oak, Limousin oak, for instance, will have a completely different characteristic to a Spanish oak, which is again completely different to an American white oak. So the actual tree is important, as well as the type of wine, the type of grapes and all that in there. So it's one of these things that I'm managing to answer this by not answering it. Because I don't think there is a hard and fast rule that makes perfect sense. There are too many variables in there to be able to come up with one simple answer.
It sounds like you're going for a run for Prime Minister soon there, Graham. But Don, you touched on something that I think is very important in part of this question, because if, for example, we used a French oak cask that had a lot of tannins in the wood, the second time we would use it, it would maybe have less so because the first spirit has stripped that out of the wood. But in relation to this question, the point that you made is that we can't forget that there is also tannin in the grape itself. So the wine's not just going to remove tannin from the wood, it's also going to add tannin to the overall flavour of the cask that we fill. So that's a very important point to remember.
And also it depends if you're going to re-toast it, re-char it, leave it. Like this, I think Graham's right. There's so many variables, but I do think it's more about the quality of the oak used. So if you're using a very good wine producer, they'll be buying good oak, which is going to give you what you need in a whiskey. Because at the end of the day, that's half the battle.
Exactly. No, it is. There is so many variables in there, and to be honest, that's what keeps it interesting. You know, if red wine casks just gave you a certain style of whiskey, and there was no variables in there, it would be rather dull and uninteresting. That's where the different wine and different casks from different parts of the world can have such a completely separate, sort of identity that it provides into the whiskey. So it keeps that surprise there. When you go to draw the sample after a year or so to see how it's progressing, you're never 100% sure what's going to be there. And sometimes you go, yeah, well, I was kind of expecting that. Other times you'll go, wow, that is quite amazing. So we like the wow, that is quite amazing moments, because they are interesting for us. When you go to actually nose the whiskey and see how it's all progressing. So yeah, the one thing I would say is I will never be Prime Minister, because unlike most politicians, and that video just proved it, I hate listening to the sound of my own voice.
Another question that's come in is from Mike Bateman. When you say limited edition, how limited, and will any of these show up in the States? So each expression is limited to 6,000 bottles. And that's going to be spread over around about 60 countries worldwide. I believe we are sending some over to the States. I know for sure we're sending some over to Canada, but we'll be talking hundreds of bottles there rather than thousands. So yeah, quite limited when you spread it down by country. But I think that is a perfect time now to move on to the second whiskey, which is, Don, we've already touched on Sauterne to an extent, but is the Sautern's edition. Whiskey number 2. So yeah, Don, Sauterne, very famous wine. Probably one of the most famous sweet wines in the world. So tell us a little bit more about that.
So, I mean, the one thing to always remember about French wines, when we talk about Mombasiac, we talk about Sauterne, is they're all governed by a body called an Appellation Origine Protégée, or Appellation Origine Contrôlée, and they set down rules about what can be done in the vineyards, in the winery. There's so many structures around them, and it means that only something that's called Sauterne or called Mombasiac can come from a certain specified area. This is the idea of terroir. Really may not be alive in whiskey. That's another debate. It is very much, when we talk about terroir in wine, which I will really sort of stress, we're talking about the land, the aspect, the climate, the hill types, the little ladybird that sits on the vine. There's so many things that go into that kind of area and make it special. And Sauterne's a very special region. We've talked a lot about botrytis. Here you're going to have much more Semillon. So Semillon's a fabulous grape variety. I think it's one of those grape varieties that are very overlooked. As a dry wine, it gives you this lovely sort of pear note. If it's from Hunter Valley in Australia, it gives you buttered toast and this lovely freshness. In Bordeaux, definitely it's a lot more about pears. Then it's blended oftentimes with more likely with Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc, of course, gives you those lovely, fresh, grassy, fruity, vibrant flavors. In France, a cooler climate than, say, in New Zealand, where it gives you tropicals. In France, it's giving you more of those green fruit characters and lots of citrus. So Semillon's really susceptible to botrytis. It loves botrytis. It really gets everything sort of sucked out of it. The sugar content's quite high. So Semillon sort of is about I think 8 out of 10 vines in Sauternes are Semillon. So Semillon's the main component in most Sauternes, with Sauvignon kind of just giving it a little bit more freshness, and of course some of those other varietals like Muscadel giving that sort of floral edge to it. And what happens with Sauternes? I mean, Sauternes, you definitely have much lower yields. You have a lot more concentration. There's sort of a riper character that comes through in Semillon. So aged Semillon gives you this beautiful. I mean, Sauternes is one of the longest lived wines in the world, along with some of the great Rieslings of Germany, the Tokais of Hungary. You know, these are wines that I've tasted wines back into the 30s, into the 20s, which are still insanely beautiful, and they just get this incredible concentrated dried fruits. They get this lovely sort of volatile acidity, and volatile acidity we talk about, and even in whiskey we talk about it, but it gives you this high tone note that for me, when it's in moderation, not too much, carries perfume with it. You definitely get a nuttiness on old Sauternes. Again, Sauternes is often, because it's so concentrated, going into very, very high quality new French oak casks. Could be from Allier, could be from Tronchet, less so for Limousin. Limousin tends to be more for spirits. But you know, you're getting these very, very, very high sort of new oak casks that they sit in there maybe between 18 to 36 plus months to take on that. So the oak is, especially in young Sauternes, quite prevalent. You do feel it. That's why actually for me, Sauternes, I like to drink it with a lot more age, because it gives that time for that oak to just mellow into the wine. So you're getting a lot more sort of nuttiness. You're getting a lot more kind of very concentrated dried fruit. You're getting a lot more honey. You're getting more complexity out of Sauternes than you're getting out of Mombasiac. You'll get more sort of deeper, richer fruits. And that's really, for me, what sort of puts Sauternes above something like Mombasiac in terms of quality.
And so from a whiskey side as well, Sauternes is a name that we're maybe a little bit more familiar with from casks. You know, many distilleries have used it. I know Arran have used it to great success. Tullibardine, Graham, you would have come across it in your days up at Glenmorangie as well. Yeah. For us, we released one of our Warehouse 6 editions in 2019. The 1977 was matured in Sauternes cask, and I fully say that is the best whiskey that I've ever tried to date. Just outstanding, that mix of very oxidized tomato and fruit flavors with the Sauternes influence. But using it on a younger tomato and spirit, what was your thoughts about that, taking the experience you had with using those casks at Glenmorangie as well?
Yeah, it's one of my favourite types of casks to use, ex-wine casks with whiskey. Although we don't do it that often, I always look forward to trying the whiskey once it's been in the Sauternes cask for a few months, you know, a year or two, or in this case over 3.5 years, because I've yet to experience a Sauternes cask that doesn't add lovely character into the whiskey, you know. And again, it comes back to, is that the wood that drives it, or is that the former wine contents, or probably the combination of the two, and then how the whiskey interacts with it. And that's one thing that the Tomaton spirit, with it being quite soft, fruity, lightly sweet, it interacts very well with Sauternes. And I do find as well that on this, you know, we mentioned apricot before, and I think Don mentioned peaches there. Or was it pears? I can't remember, but you still get that family of fruity notes coming through on the nose here. And the richness of a sort of syrupy honey type style in there as well. And that has to be coming predominantly from the wine cask that's influenced that. Yes, we have our house style in here, and the house style is always going to be more prevalent in the younger whiskies. You know, once you get into 20, 30, 40-year-old whiskies, the oxidation is taking over much of the character, and that's not a bad thing. If oxidation works well, it adds so much complexity into a whiskey. You mentioned the 1977 there. Well, not far from where that cask sat is the 1976. That's actually my favourite whiskey I've ever tasted on the planet, and they're actually still there maturing. And I'm hoping that they're going to become under 40% and we can't actually sell them, and I then have access to them for the rest of my days. But no, it is, the Sauterne undoubtedly works tremendously well with tomato spirit. And I think, to be honest, I think it works well at both the older age where there is more oxidative flavours, as well as in this younger one at just 12-year-old. I think the marriage of the wine with our style of spirit has worked very, very well here.
I think here you definitely see that richness coming through. I think there's much more kind of concentrated fruit notes here. For me, this is almost an apricot tart tatin. You've got that sort of caramelized note here. You've got that lovely sort of richness, apricot crumble or apricot clafouti or something. I'm really getting something sort of like candied notes to it, which is very Sauterne. And I think there is definitely more nuttiness. I'm getting that nuttiness on the finish here, and I don't know if it's just a kind of psychological thing, because I often think sometimes these things are psychological, but it feels more viscous in my mouth.
Definitely,
more viscous.
I completely agree. For me, there is almost a little bit like the syrup from a can of tinned peaches. That sort of peach syrup. I get a lot of that. Oddly tonight, and this is the first time that I've come across this note as I've been trying this, a herbal note as well. And it's almost like a sweet tobacco that I got on the nose at first there. It's not something I've come across in any of the past tastings I've done of this. So it might just be me tonight, but just that wonderful earthy herbally note.
I think I see what you mean. I got it as toasted coconut actually in the beginning, and sometimes I do get coconut on Sauterne occasionally, and that's the cask for me.
Yeah, I was going to agree that the one thing I find in here is coconut. Or it reminds me of playing golf here in my local course where there's lots of gorse bushes, which is the same aroma, and that's definitely in here as well. Yeah.
I see maybe to dried sort of sage or something.
Yeah. I thought, Graham, you were going to try and convince us that you've got coconut trees growing over in Murrayshire there. I was having none of it. So
I could point my webcam out into my garden and let you see the palm trees if you want.
Yeah. The inflatable one.
And I have my backdrop now.
Exactly.
I almost feel like I should take you in there.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love this, I have to say. It has to be one of my favourite limited editions that we've ever done at Tomaton. And I may be slightly biased because of the Sauterne and how much I actually love Sauterne. It's not good me being diabetic. I like the sweeter things in life.
But I think what's quite interesting with this one, and I think this is again going back to Sam's question, like for me, there's a structure to this whiskey. There is more tannin there. There's definitely a dryness that comes through, then that sweetness, that sweet apricot kind of comes and lifts on the finish. And for me, that would definitely be because in Sauterne you are using really good casks. I mean, even the worst chateaus are using decent casks because it costs so much to produce Sauterne. You're just not going to put it into Grappo.
Exactly. Why would you? Yes. It makes no sense. Yeah. No, I do. I absolutely love that. The one interesting question I was going, well, maybe not interesting to me, I was going to ask you, Don, is that so far tonight we've not added any water.
Mm-hmm.
Would you normally, in a Tudor tasting, add water, or do you prefer to do everything neat, or do you do both? What's your thoughts on how to conduct tastings?
It's a really, really good question, and I always taste neat first. Always. If I feel that the alcohol is a little unbalanced, that's when I'll add, because it doesn't necessarily mean the whiskey is unbalanced. It just means that maybe my palate's picking up alcohol a little bit more. I rarely, I think for me, I always drink. I like drinking cask strength whiskey. Bit of an alcoholic, essentially. I do like, as long as alcohol's in balance. For me, it's when you feel alcohol here not warming but aggressively that maybe then I would add a little bit. But I always think actually by adding alcohol, what's quite interesting is you get more aroma.
Yes, you do normally. Yeah.
So if I find something was a little tight or I wasn't quite getting all the flavor profiles I'd want, then I'll just add some water just to dilute it down to just get aroma up up out of the glass. But I don't think it's a hard and fast rule. I think it's a really hard question. I've not answered it in your words, Graham.
Exactly. I mean, I'm inclined to be the same. If I'm doing it for the purposes of purely analysis of the whiskey, we would normally add water, bring it down to, let's say, 20% alcohol. But that can really ruin the whiskey on a taste profile. But it's just the fact that all of these are at 46% alcohol by volume, but you just don't get any sensation of that strength in there at all. They are very, very smooth and easy going.
I almost think that Sakinda and I always talk about this. We always think that we'd love sort of cognacs and things to be around that sort of 43 to 46%, because we actually think it's a sweet spot for alcohol, because I think it allows the alcohol to carry more flavors than you would do at 40%. So, I like something that's just got a little bit more punch, as it were, because I think it just carries flavor a little bit better.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's one of these things that sometimes, whiskies I actually prefer with a splash of water. Other times I think it really spoils them. And it doesn't mean that it's good whiskey and bad whiskey. It just means that different whiskies need different things, whether it be water, ice. Actually, you spoke earlier about the KB bar in Edinburgh. I've been in there quite a few times over the years, mostly on rugby days, I have to say.
Of course, it was the place to go.
Absolutely. And also Dave Broom, you mentioned at the end of your sort of introduction. And Dave Broom is the guy who got me onto drinking whiskey and Diet Coke.
I love it.
And it's become probably too much my drink of choice. I drink, vodka and Coke, Jack Daniels Coke, rum and Coke. I never ever drank whiskey and Coke until I was in his company one day, and he actually said to a whole room, that we're too crazy about whiskey. Why don't we drink it with Coke? My drink of choice, potentially now, just for sheer enjoyment, sitting watching a movie, whatever, would be a whiskey, ice, and Diet Coke, which is complete sacrilege to the purists. But so it's strange how you've learnt so much over the years, from KB right through to Dave Broom, and I've not followed in any way whatsoever, but they're both there.
Ian would be very proud of me right now. But I think that's it. You always drink how you want to drink, and I think that's so key. Don't let anyone tell you how to drink what you like, because it's your preference.
It's personal choice, very, very subjective, and that's kind of why I asked you the question about the water, was what your preference, if you had one, was. And I think we're of similar mind. There are no rights and wrongs. Yes.
I do enjoy telling people that in a tasting, because I think, when you introduce the concept of whiskey cocktails, there's almost that eyes glazing over, this is standard brand ambassador patter now. There's nothing better than being able to say, well, our master distiller drinks Kubokken and Coke on a Friday night. So, or Diet Coke, we've got to be specific. But going back to the tasting side of things, and we talked about the strength there, I think what's so important on a series like this with the 46% is that we haven't needed to chill filter these whiskies. They're non-chill filtered. Mm-hmm. So much of what we've talked about so far has been the texture. Yes. On both of these whiskies that we've tried so far, the texture has been really key to the overall understanding of what the cask has contributed. And I think we couldn't have done that if we had bottled them at 40%, at 43%. So this higher strength is ideal here. But we do have a video of Sauternes to play as well. And Graham, you also have a starring role in this one. So we'll play this now.
Foggy mornings and sunny afternoons allow the vineyards of Sauternes to produce the sweetened grapes for which the region is celebrated. We have sourced casks from this region to capture the unique flavours from wines produced with the rare white grapes of Sauternes. Distilled in September 2008, this expression brings a burst of citrus notes calmed by the scent of peach, apricot and manuka honey. The finish is wonderfully sweet, with a freshness indicative of the wine that once occupied these casks. Hailing from the Highlands, our distillery is located in the remote village of Tomaton. With the naturally soft water of the Altnafrith Burn and the tender Scottish barley on our doorstep, we have been producing single malt Scotch whisky since 1897. The Sauterne edition, part of the Tomaton French collection.
Lovely to see a little bit of France there as well. I think that brings these whiskies to life, and it brings what we're talking about to life a little bit more. We'll just jump into the comments a little bit before we go on to the third and final whiskey. Dennis is saying that he gets lovely notes of rhubarb in the Mombasiac, and for me, rhubarb is a note that always shines in the Tomaton New Make Spirit, but it's always something that I struggle to actually pick out in the final whiskies. Great to see it coming back on the Mombasiac here. And Greg's Whiskey Guide is joining us from France. So he's going to be critiquing your pronunciation tonight, Graham. But one thing he's asked, and it's an interesting one, is do we know how old the Sauterne that was in the casks was before we got them?
Unfortunately not, no. It's one of the things when we buy some casks direct from the actual, whether it be the Bodega or the vineyard or whatever, we get some direct from the actual previous user. But when they come through a cooperage, there's normally a layer of secrecy there. Sometimes they will tell us, what age, whether it be a wine or a spirit that was previously in there. We've had Tawny Port casks that were 50 years old, and the previous contents in them had actually been about 30, type idea. So you sometimes do get that information, but not always. And in this case, we didn't get the information. It's one of the things, sometimes you can find the telltale signs on the casks themselves because there may be an year stamped on them. But from memory, I don't think there was in any of these that could give us any sort of indication whatsoever. No, so I wish I did know, and I would love to know, which chateau the Sauterne came from. Was it the one that we all know how to spell but don't necessarily all know how to pronounce? Or
I think that's a great point as well, because what I've found is that if you're speaking to wineries from Portugal or from Spain or from Italy, they want you to use their name on everything. And let's collaborate here and have that real approach. But for whatever reason, the French producers tend to keep their cards quite close to their chest, and it's very, very difficult to find out from the cooperage, and sometimes even from the winery themselves. We've had experiences of working directly with the winery, and they've said, we would love to try the whiskey afterwards, but please don't mention our name, which is really quite interesting. And I think everyone knows what we try and do at Tomaton is be as transparent and as open as possible. So if we did have that information, we would love to share it. But sadly, for the great wines and the great whiskies that they allow us to create, we don't get to know where they come from, which is a shame.
I think it will change. I think that at the moment the French are very protective because they don't trust maybe how their casks are used. And I get that, because I do think there is an issue in whiskey production where they don't understand the wines that they're using, so they're not representing those wines beautifully at the finish. And I think that is changing as more and more whiskey makers are getting maybe more confident and understanding wine more. I think every whiskey maker should do WSET for level 2 and 3, because I think you do need to understand the wine and where it comes from to actually be able to use it, because of course those flavors are there. And I do think that's there. It's interesting. I've been working with Richard Patterson for a bit on wine casks, and I've been helping him source the odd cask from chateaus that will, or wineries that will allow him to use their names. But it is hard, and that's me having relationships with a lot of these producers. So I do understand, and I think it's the same. It's about what the final liquid tastes like, and will it represent their house how they want it to be represented.
And the problem is that, well, it's not a problem, but it's. I can fully understand why, especially the more famous chateaus, have a reputation that they've spent decades, if not even centuries, building up. Why would they want to take the chance on us actually putting something into the market that didn't reach the same standards as they set? So I can fully appreciate where they're coming from, which which means it's quite often the lesser wines that will be happy for you to use their name. And I don't mean lesser wines in a particularly derogatory way. It's just that they're not so well known. They might be happier for you to use their name, but using their name doesn't really give us much of an advantage, you know. So I think I would like to think that the relationship between Scotch whisky and French wine, etc., can become more sort of harmonious and trusting in years to come. But it's at the same time, does it really matter? You know, is it going to make our whisky so much better if it was Château d'Yquem rather than another Sauterne? I don't really know if it would make such a big difference, because there's so little of the previous contents left there. Will it have that much of an impact that would actually be noticeable over and above the oak and such like?
I think it's going back to the idea of, as long as you're working with a very good winery, and the casks were good, I think that's the key. You know, like I think, like for me, when I am talking to people like sort of Richard Seal from Foursquare, you know, we talk a lot about where he can source wine casks from, and you know, I've sort of tried to help a little bit in the same way as some other sort of whiskey producers, but it's about making sure that the right wine, they're getting good quality wine that's gone into good quality barrels, which again then feeds back into good quality liquid at the end.
I think as well, making sure the wine they are looking for matches the spirit that they have. You know, there would be nothing worse than a very light floral spirit being overpowered by a super heavy wine cask, and vice versa. So it's a lot of moving parts, a lot of cogs in that conversation there. But it's like you said,
tea for all whiskey producers that want to use wine casks.
I'm not sure I have the concentration span any longer to do that.
Well, at least you're drinking with me.
That we can do.
That we can do, yes, that we can do.
So I think now we'll move on to whiskey number 3, which is the Reeve Salt edition. And Dawn, I can't wait to hear this, because when I was reading up about Reeve Salt, it is one of the most fascinating, bonkers winemaking processes I've come across, and I love every bit of it. So I can't wait to hear what you've got to say about this wine.
So Reeve Salt is really interesting. It's from the region of Roussillon, which is down in the south of France. So we always think of sort of the Languedoc-Roussillon, that beautiful stretch of southern coast of France, which is very, very much influenced by the Mediterranean. And as you get into Roussillon, it's not only the Mediterranean influences, but the Pyrenees, because you're right on the border with Spain there. It's quite a big area. You know, Roussillon, Languedoc-Roussillon is the biggest wine region in France. You know, it really is where a lot of sort of the powerhouse of the wines come from, big sort of wineries and things like that. And Roussillon is really interesting. There's a lot of sort of sunshine. I think it's something like 300 and like either 25 or something days of sunshine a year in Roussillon. I'm like, I need to be there right now. So, you know, there's a lot of sunshine. There's a lot of heat. There's a lot of warmth. And it's where traditionally the grapes that like that come from, and especially Grenache. So Grenache can come in various different forms. It can be Grenache Gris, it can be Grenache Blanc, and it can be Grenache Rouge. So white, pink, white, grey, and red. And Rousseau is very interesting. It's what we call a vin doux naturel. So a vin doux naturel is made in a very similar way to port. So it's made by moutage. So here what you have is that you stop fermentation by the addition of a neutral grape spirit at some point during the process of fermentation. So here you're looking, I think normally you're left with about 100 grams per litre residual sugar. If you look at something like Sauterne, it's around 120 plus, 160. Mombasiac will be roughly about the same, a little less. So, you know, it's slightly drier in style. And the thing here that's sort of really key is there's very different styles of Riesau. I mean, you can get a Riesau that's Riesau Muscat, which is a slightly more floral kind of style. I'm feeling this is probably classic Riesau. So there's slight different styles. You can have a rosé, which is sort of youthful. It's only 3 months of age, sort of very sort of fresh and light, a little bit, almost think of it more like a Pinot de Charente or something like that. You have a Grenat, which again has a little bit more age. This is about 7 months, I think, off the top of my head. usually using a sort of Grenache Noir. And then you have an Ambre and a Tulle, and an Audage, which is either one of the two. And here you've kind of got a lot more Grenache Noir, it tends to be a bit more Grenache Noir heavy, 2 years. So you're getting much more oxidative aging. And here's where with the Riesel, you get these really lovely sort of fresh, young, vibrant ones to this lovely sort of oxidized, nutty, almost sherry kind of style of sort of more like an Oloroso style. But yeah, so an Audage would be 5 years aging. So you can really get some very nutty, intense styles, a little bit kind of, they're great with chocolate. I mean, I really love Riesel with chocolate or a hard cheese, something that just takes that, especially in an older Riesel, the slightly sort of 2 years to 5 year styles, where that kind of raisined fruit and Grenache is as itself a really juicy, ripe style. We think of Southern Rhone wines. We think of those lovely reds that are just so easy drinking. And Grenache actually has quite high alcohol. So when you get a Vin Doux Natural, you're talking between 15 and 17% alcohol. So you're getting a higher ABV as well from these. But there is just something really lovely about it. When you get a really great Riesel, it's like just delicious. It really has such interest and such. For me, it's kind of one of those ones when you try really old ones, you're just like, what just happened there? I don't really understand it, but I really love it because you've got red fruits, you've got nuts, you've got just a bit of everything. They're fantastic wines and really, really rare. I mean, you don't see them very often nowadays, even though actually there's a huge percentage made in Roussillon. And actually it doesn't come from sort of one area within Roussillon. There's not like a Riesel area, there's a Riesel designation, but it's pretty much the whole of the Roussillon can make a Riesel, as long as they stick within the laws of using the moutage and the aging techniques, depending on what wine they're making. So yeah, it's a really fascinating a really fascinating wine, and just something that's just a bit different, and kind of almost, it's one of those ones that it's like Riesling. The wine people love it, but we don't see it often enough.
Well, it was one that massively piqued my interest because I'm a big fan of fortified wines, and when you think of these fortified processes, we think of the sherries, we think of the ports, but I'd never really considered, do France use this process at all? And it really this whiskey opened my eyes to this process in France. And so I do my Google search of reef salt production, and then I see these lines and lines and lines of glass demijohns left under the sun. What is going on there?
So some producers will actually actively oxidatively age, because what happens when you're sort of making a fortified wine, because you've added alcohol, you're giving it a layer of protection. If you deliberately oxidize a wine, you actually, when it's sort of in fermentation or sort of just past fermentation, you're actually protecting that wine as well, because by oxidizing it, you're giving it more stability, which is in itself quite a kind of backwards thought. This is why sherries are oxidized. And, you still get an amazing product, even though it's essentially an oxidized wine. So, some Riesel producers are actively almost like Madeirizing the wines. That's probably the best way of putting it. So when you're producing Madeira, you heat it to protect it. And that's what gives you this ability to age so long. I mean, Madeira, you could drink for centuries. I mean, I've had Madeiras from the 1800s, which are insanely good. So what they're doing there is almost actively baking the wine to protect it so it can withstand that. And, and that process of adding the alcohol to it, that process of oxidatively aging, and that process of baking, for want of a better word, the wine itself is in essence protecting it, which you can do when you have quite a robust wine. And there's some incredibly amazing Vin Doux Naturals from that area, Banyuls, incredible. I mean, oh my god, so it's a really interesting process that can create very different styles. And that's why I was saying, there's some that are really fresh and bright and fruity, which are your kind of very young ones that are only aged the sort of 7 months or so. all the way to these Audages Plus, which are sort of 5 years. But if you're going to age wine for that long, because there's this action of the oxygen on the alcohols and on the fruit and on the tannins, you have to give it a fighting chance by giving it a layer of protection, and that's what oxidatively aging and heat aging will do, if that makes sense.
And Graham, Reef Salts, it was a new one on me when we got the opportunity to get these casks. Is it something you've used at all? Something you've seen before? I've only seen it in one other whiskey.
Nope, I must admit, when Andrew offered me these casks, it was a case of, well, A, how do you pronounce that? And B, what is that? I honestly had no idea either. I was just sitting here thinking, listening to Dawn, I could quite happily sit here and listen to her all night, talk about wine, because she's so passionate about it, but it also makes me realise I know so little about it as well. You know, so no, I never heard.
I'll teach you wine.
That's a deal. That's a deal. So yeah, I hadn't heard of them at all, but I do love the effect they've had. It was quite interesting. You were speaking there, Don, and you mentioned that you would love to drink this with likes of chocolate or cheese. The one thing I found in the nose while I don't know if it's by suggestion, but I was listening to you, and the thing that I find really stands out in this is a nuttiness, but it's like a chocolate covered nut. It's what I find in the nose in this. That's the key sort of aroma that really stood out to me. In this.
I'd be really interested. This is the one actually that I was like, I wonder what Riveso it was that was in there, because I don't think it was a really old oxidative style, because there is red fruit here.
Yeah.
So my feeling is probably fairly young still and hasn't had that oxidative, but enough oxidative just to give you, as you say, that sort of chocolate covered nuts, which I think you can find in younger Riveso for sure, you know. And it's a really interesting one, this one. This is the one I kind of was like, I think here the structure again is gone up another level. I think you've lost that sort of roundness that you get in the Sauterne and the freshness you get in the Mombasiac. Here you've got a real. It's almost a little bit meaty.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I get a lot more spice on this one than I did on any of the other two. A lot more cinnamon, ginger, even kind of going towards that almost paprika-y level of spice.
And the chocolate I found there, having now tasted it and let it evolve, it's definitely of a dark chocolate type variety. You know, it's not a white chocolate or a milk chocolate. This is definitely a dark chocolate. It's got a hint of almost the bitterness of a dark chocolate in there while still being sweet. It's a bit of a contradiction in a lot of ways.
No, I know what you mean, and I think here that the tannin is. I'm feeling the tannins here, and then actually for people who don't really know what tannin is stew a tea bag for too long, and that's what tannin is. Tannin is that puckering sensation on the inside of your mouth, but there's enough fruit, I think, from
to balance that off,
to just hold that tannin and keep it all bound together. It feels like a lovely ball of deliciousness, you know, like kind of all knitted together. Very, very interesting.
I've just gone back and nosed the Sauterne, having had a taste of this, and it is so much lighter and more sort of vanilla type sweetness compared with this one, which is the dark chocolate type.
Almost banana on the Sauterne now. A lot of banana on the Sauterne for me. That tropical layer.
Yeah.
Now, one of the questions that came in ahead of time was what foods we would pair each of these whiskies with, and we could maybe do a quick fire round. I'm going to start it off because for me, the Sauterne with some nice blue cheese is a wonderful kind of contrast. The sweet honeyed tropical notes of the Sauterne with a nice blue cheese would be perfect for me.
Well, you know my answer to this, because what's the one food I would always eat?
Mussels.
No, it's close, but scallops.
Scallops, Scallops.
Scallops.
Yeah.
I would have scallops with all three. I would have scallops with everything, mind you, so I'm not really being very sort of selective here, but no, it's I'd actually forgotten just how big a difference there was between these three whiskies, but just going back and nosing them now.
Yeah, they're very, very different. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
For me, that Mombasiac, I would actually want something quite fresh at seafood wise, but I would go something a little bit fresher, maybe prawns, something that's got a lovely sort of fruit to it itself as a food.
Yeah.
And then I go into something like that Sauterne, and that's why I want that tart tatin. I want a dessert with that. And that Reeves, so just because that tannin structure, actually, I'd love to try it, and I'd be really, really interested to try it with maybe slightly, not a really stinky cheese up to a poisse level, but maybe something slightly creamy, maybe something sort of like not quite like when you get stinking bishop, where it's just going to that sort of bacon rind note. I'd be quite interested to try that with it, because something in my head makes me think it might just work.
Yeah, I think that would work well. Yeah.
It's interesting. Like I know there's something here that I almost would maybe even pair it with something like tagine. Because there's fruit there.
One of the tastings we did earlier in the week, someone suggested that the reef salt would be fantastic with a cigar. Now, I'm not a smoker at all, so it's not something that I would go for, but that kind of pairing, I think the thought behind it was that there is that robustness that holds up well against a nice cigar. So he never gave me much.
Style, like a Romeo and Julieta, for sure. Something a little bit lighter in terms of a smoke.
Yeah.
Lovely. A short, light smoke. Yeah, for sure.
And for me, like the reef salt with like a dark chocolate tart, like a dark chocolate Grenache tart would be wonderful for me. That's what I would go for. But yeah, so hopefully that's that question answered, because it certainly made me hungry.
Exactly, yes.
Uber.
Salted caramel popcorn, Krish has said for him.
Now, Krish, if you're talking popcorn pairings, I am the queen of popcorn pairings.
I'm with you there, Don. Whiskey and popcorn. You'll never watch movies the same way again. It's a game changer. It is a game changer. I love it. So yeah.
Genius.
But salted or sweet?
I am very much a salted popcorn lady. But when I do my popcorn pairings, I use Joe and Seth's, and some of their sweet ones work super well. I actually wonder if that one might. I've just taken on one that's like a Thai peanut curry one, which I think would work quite nicely with the Sauterne. Be pulling a pack later.
We did the BBC Good Food Show a couple of years ago, and it just so happened that we were right next to the Joe and Seth's stand there, which was wonderful. But for me, they had a mince pie flavored popcorn that worked incredibly well with the classic Tomaton 12-year-old, that traditional Highland style. So yeah, I'm going to have to. I think whiskey and popcorn tasting nights is something I want to look into in much more depth. So.
Purely for research purposes only. It's not like we're going to enjoy it or anything.
No, I mean it's at our expense. You know, we'll brave those waters.
We'll make that sacrifice. Yeah.
Done.
But I mean, 3 incredible whiskies for me. I think very different. At first, I think the Mombasiac and the Sauterne, on the first nose, there's a lot of similarity, but when you go back to them, they become quite different, especially on the mouthfeel. And then the reef salt really throws a different flavour in the mix. This is a series of 4 whiskies, though. We have released the first 3 now, and the 4th will be made available in August, September time. And that's where we go beyond the influence of French wines, and we have a cognac edition coming out. And Dawn, I know your love of cognac is as much, if not greater, as your love of sweet wines. So we will hopefully get you back on later in the year to break that one down for us, because I was blown away by the whiskey. Totally different to anything we've tried tonight. So that will be something really exciting for later on in the year. But overall, Dawn, Graham, your thoughts on trying these side by side, compare and contrast?
I think it's so much fun. It was the same with the Quattro. You know, the opportunity to see what influence the different style of, in this case, wine has on the whiskey. It's a sort of thing that, I mean, maybe the Reef Salt's slightly different, but certainly the Mombasiac and the Sauterne, if you tasted one tonight and then tasted one on Saturday night, like you said earlier, there's so many similarities there that you may actually struggle to tell them apart. Tasting them side by side, you spot, yes, there are similarities there, but the differences are quite immense as well. You know, so I think that's the good fun part, is that you do get the chance to try the three different ones. And doing it side by side means that you don't have to try and remember all the aromas and tastes. You know, you have them in front of you, so it makes it far more obvious the differences that are there, and you can then choose your favourite or your three favourites, whatever it may be, type idea. So yeah, to me it goes back to that statement I made earlier about being educational, and I don't think it's educational. It's certainly not me educating anyone about wine, not like Don can do, but it's educating your own sense of smell and palate as to what differences the wine can make.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I love about them is that I know I can still taste the distillery character through them, and you know, in a way, for me, the wine cask has a layer of complexity to them, but I think that what I love about them is they're just drinkable. I just want to drink them, and I think that's the goal, surely, of anything, that you just want. These are session whiskies, you know. You quite happily sit here and drink them. You know, I'm happy to sit here for the rest of the evening and drink them. But, you know, and I think it is so interesting, and it's really rare that we're able to taste things comparatively. You know, and I think that's what's been so interesting for me, is actually to see that there are quite, and yeah, you're right. The Mombasiac and the Sauterne, there's subtle differences, but we've talked a lot about texture tonight, and I think we need to talk more about texture when we're talking about spirit. We don't talk about texture enough, and texture is so hugely important.
Yeah.
It's one of our senses. Touch is such an important sense, and I think they've all been very, very different, both in terms of flavor, in terms of texture, but that distillery character is still there. And Graham, I love them. They're really, really nice, juicy, lovely whiskies that I'm happy to drink now.
Well, that's good to hear. That's very good to hear.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And all I can say is thank you, everyone, for joining in. Graham, as always, thank you for sharing your wisdom on what's going on at Tomaton and how we're making these wonderful whiskies. And Don, thank you so much for, as we said earlier on, the people that come across in the industry and share their passion and wisdom are what makes everyone better. So thank you so much for sharing a bit of that with us tonight. We have one last clip to play, which is of the Reef Salt edition, and that's what we'll leave everyone on. So all that's left for me to say is thank you so much to everybody.
Yep, thank you indeed, yes. And thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The deep south of France is home to Reef Salt wine. Its Mediterranean climate allows the wine to oxidise in the cask, creating a natural sweetness that the region is famed for. It is these barriques that we have selected to add the distinctive influence of the Vin du Natural to our single malt. We are first met with the aromas of barley. Leading into the first sip, the flavour dances somewhere between sweet and bitter, ending with a smooth, velvety finish that lingers for some time. The Reef Salt casks are transported to our small highland village. Here at Tomaton, we are one of the few distilleries that still boasts an on-site cooper, a legacy that runs deep through our history. The Reef Salt edition, part of the Tomaton French collection.